We have 4 speakers who are going to talk for 15 minutes each. So we have to ask you to observe the time limit. We will have the Q&A session at the end after everyone have their talks. So please take notes and ask your questions either on the chat function in Zoom window or by raising your hand and speak up. That might be actually easier. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. Paula Martinez-Sire is Assistant Professor of Japanese Studies at Nihon University College of International Relations in Mishima, Japan. She has her bachelor's degree in Translation and Interpreting Studies from the Autonomous University of Barcelona and PhD in International Culture and Communication Studies at Waseda University. In her dissertation, she analyzed the cultural references, paratext, and translation methods of the several translations of Higuchi Ichiyo's Takekurabe into modern Japanese, English, Spanish, and Catalan. The title of today's talk is The Translator's Voice of Mrs. Kashi Iwamoto, an analysis of Wakamatsu Shizuko's English translation of Japanese classics. Okay, so without further ado, please. Maybe you can start by sharing your screen.
Sure. Thank you very much for this introduction and for the EAJS to prepare this very complete conference-like experience. Even though it's online, it feels like a success. Yeah. Since I have some Wi-Fi troubles, I pre-recorded my presentation, and now the IT person in charge, if they can kindly share it in my place, that'd be great. Thank you very much. Yeah, you can start it, and I will leave you with this.
Hello, everyone. This is Paula Martinez-Sires, and I am an assistant professor at Nihon University in Japan. The title of my presentation is The Translator's Voice of Mrs. Kashi Iwamoto, an analysis of Wakamatsu Shizuko's English translations of Japanese classics. Today, through a textual and paratextual analysis, I will explore the translator's voice that Wakamatsu Shizuko adopted when, by using her real name of Kashi Iwamoto, she inverse translated the Japanese classic Ends Not Meeting at the Last Reckoning of the Year by Ihara Saikaku from Japanese into English. First, this is the table of contents for this presentation. Well, first, let me briefly introduce who Wakamatsu Shizuko was. She lived during Meiji period. She was a woman writer, essayist, and translator who was normally associated to her role as a divulgator of children's literature. But as I said, she also wrote and she translated and contributed to the Genbun Ichi literary movement in Meiji Japan. Also, thanks to her Western-style education, her English was practically almost native, even though she never went overseas herself. This led her to translate several English classics into Japanese, such as Wasuregatami, Adelaide and Proctor's The Sailor Boy, or Shokoushi, Frances Hutton Burnett's Little Lord Fauntleroy, probably her most renowned translation. She also did inverse translations of Japanese classics into English, and these translations, alongside English written essays on several topics ranging from women's education to introducing the Japanese culture and traditions to Western readers, were published in the English language periodical The Japan Evangelist under her real name Mrs. Kashi Iwamoto, and they were aimed at foreigners residing in Japan but also overseas. This presentation then is focusing on what we could call, chronologically speaking, this last inverse translation phase. In previous research, I analyzed Wasuregatami, the Memento, Shizuko's translation into Japanese of Adelaide Proctor's The Sailor Boy, And the research results showed that she experienced with language and style by using a very particular form of genbun ichi and other end of the sentence particles to characterize the characters of Wasuregatami of this story. One of the results or conclusions of this research is that her experimentalism is what translations to the scholar Lawrence Venuti would call a defamiliarizing and foreignizing translation style. Now, in my current research, my current research is focusing on the analysis of Shizuko's translation phase as an inverse translator, when she always signed her with her real name, not Wakamatsu Shizuko, but Mrs. Kashi Iwamoto. And I plan to compare her methodology when inverse translating in order to determine the similitudes and differences in her translation style. She did not inverse translate many works, 3 or 4 tops, and most of them were short texts. And the longest one was the one that I will analyze in this presentation, titled "Ends Not Meeting at the Last Reckoning of This Year," which is also why I chose this text for analysis. The research questions, the things that I'm asking are, what is the translator's voice of Iwamoto Kashi against that of Wakamatsu Shizuko's? So, in other words, how different is her translation methodology or praxis when inverse translating? In this presentation, then, I will focus on the inverse translated text and paratexts of Ends Not Meeting on the Last Reckoning of the Year, Shizuko's English translation of Ihara Saikaku's O Tsugomori Awanu Sanyo, originally published, the translation I mean, in the Japan Evangelist in 1894. I must say that this research is still ongoing, and due to time constraints, today I will focus on the qualitative analysis of the paratexts in this translation. Paratexts can be defined as the presenters of the literary work according to Genet. Translators' prefaces and footnotes particularly help to extrapolate information on the translation process, as well as on the translation norms or ideological stance of the translators, according to Dimitriou and Gourcelag. By looking into the paratexts of this text and the reasons behind its selection, which is a short story commending the honor of the samurai, and also by analyzing the translation methodology, I want to offer a new lens through which to look at Shizuko's translational identity, to look at how she translated the text, and what information she deemed necessary to add in her text. So let us take a look at the work that we are going to analyze, Ends Not Meeting at the Last Reckoning of the Year. This story, it tells the story of Samurai Naisuke Harada, who at the end of the year finds himself in a tight spot and receives 10 pieces of gold from his wife's brother. He then invites his fellow samurai, all of them out of service like himself, in an end-of-the-year party. But then one of the gold pieces disappears, and the samurais wish to be clear out of suspicion, to the extreme that one of them will kill himself so they can search their body looking for the missing coin. But then after some time looking and searching for the coin in the room, to everyone's rejoice, not 1 but 2 gold pieces are found, which means that there is extra money. But because of shame, no one will actually claim that extra piece of gold. So Naisuke has an idea. He turns off the candlelight, asks his fellow samurai that the owner of the coin takes it back when it's pitch dark. So once he lights the candle again, the extra coin has disappeared, to everyone's surprise and rejoice. The story ends here with the moral or the sentence: how delicate the behavior of the guests. Such indeed is a specimen of the intercourse between samurai. So again, this story by Ihara Saikaku, translated by Iwamoto Kashi or Wakamatsu Shizuko, kind of comments the honor of the samurai. Some of them were willing to kill themselves in order to prove their innocence. And these are some ideas that maybe the foreign readers might find appealing. Shizuko's translation is actually not that long. The original text is not long either. It takes around 3-4 pages in the journal, The Japan Evangelist. And before the text starts, there's a translator's preface written by Iwamoto or Wakamatsu Shizuko. In this presentation, I will take a look at the paratexts, meaning the prefaces, footnotes added by the translator, in order to qualitatively analyze these paratexts and try to see if there's a relation as to why she decided to translate this text. So first, let us take a look at the translator's preface. The preface starts by presenting the author of the source text, Ihara Saikaku, to the audience. Haikai poet and novelist Saikaku was one of the most important literary figures in the 17th century in Japan. And he was also credited by partaking in the revival of Japanese literature. He wrote several stories about the floating world and about tradesmen's lives, and not so many about samurai. So it's interesting that this is the story that was picked to be translated and offered to the foreign audience. In this preface, in this translator's preface, Wakamatsu Shizuko refers to Saikaku's styles as an oddity of the style, rather ungrammatical in character but interesting withal. Saikaku's prose must have been a little bit difficult to translate to her. She received again a Western education. She also learned Japanese classics, but she kind of felt a proximity to the English language or literature at least. So this a little bit old Japanese must have proven a little bit difficult for her to translate. Maybe this is why she points out in the preface that her translation hardly does justice to the original. Maybe here Shizuko, we could say that she's prioritizing the source text over the target text. This is actually a very long debate in translation studies, the preference of the wholly original versus the mundane translation. Although it could be considered maybe false modesty, it remains true that there were not many women nor men for that matter who could produce a good inverse translation from English into Japanese at that period of time without ever being overseas. And even though it's probable that the editors of the journal, missionaries, community members of the evangelical church in Japan, maybe some of them probably looked over the translation and may have corrected some typos, but still, nevertheless, what Shizuko accomplished in this inverse translation is hardly something to be ashamed of, as she kind of says through this preface. Finally, at the end of the preface, she says that this text, Saikaku's work, is a curiosity in our national literature. So she purposely chose this text because she deemed it maybe a curiosity or relevant enough to be interesting for the foreign readers. So she was very aware of her addressee, she was aware of her readers, and thought that maybe this text would be deemed interesting enough for foreigners to read and learn about Japan in this concrete context. Now, let us take a look at the translator's footnotes. Translators' prefaces and footnotes, as previously stated, particularly help to extrapolate information on the translation process, as well as the translation norms or the ideological stance of the translators. In this text, there are a total of 5 footnotes. It could seem a small number, but given the fact that the translation itself is only 3 or 4 pages long, the ratio is actually rather high, which means that Shizuko wanted to add as much information as she deemed necessary for the target text to convey its meaning to the target audience. Now please take a look at this chart. As we can see, the translator differentiates two categories of footnotes, the asterisk footnotes and the cross footnote. The asterisk footnotes are number 1, 3, 4, 5, and the cross footnote is number 2. Arguably, the asterisk footnotes are related to concrete words or cultural reference in the source language, although there is no consistency in the way the translator uses them, because sometimes Shizuko will include the original Japanese word in italics, such as with kozuka or maruando, and other times she will only include the literal translation of the word, as it is the case with paper-made frocks. On the other hand, the cross footnote does not seem to refer to a particular cultural reference or Japanese word that is difficult to translate and that will be obscure when translated without an extra commentary, but rather a simple sentence that contains a cultural background that the target reader will not fully grasp unless there is an added explanation. The Japanese reader, for instance, when reading the original of Saikaku, will understand that nuts, a dried chestnut, or pines is a reference to New Year's Eve or New Year's, but the foreign reader might not. Hence, here Shizuko is again providing the reader with extra cultural background relevant to the story. Again, this demonstrates how aware she was of her target readership and of the translation methodology needed to actually translate, make understandable the source culture, her own culture, to the foreign target readership. In conclusion, then, it could be said that Wakamatsu Shizuko uses a rather foreignizing approach in the translation of cultural reference or paratexts by including Japanese words in the translation and adding extra information in the footnotes, which is one of the characteristics of foreignizing approaches in translation studies. This stance is rather different than the one used in, for instance, her translation of The Sailor Boy or Wasuregatami from English into Japanese. So we can see that according to the period of her translation phase, the translation methods of at least paratext shift or change or adapt over time or according to which language or culture she is translating to. In relation to this, Rebecca Copeland wrote regarding Wakamatsu Shizuko's translation style that Shizuko picked the kimono collar more appropriate for her target readership in each occasion. Even though she was referring to Little Lord Fauntleroy's translation, this analogy also works with her inverse phase. Because when inverse translating, Wakamatsu Shizuko, or rather Mrs. Kashi Iwamoto, picked yet another kimono collar or translator identity to best deliver the source text to this particular target readership in this specific context. These are the final thoughts of this presentation. As I mentioned earlier, this is an ongoing research project, and the next steps are that I will be analyzing the translation methodology used and compare it against her English into Japanese translations. The analysis of the paratext already shows that there are some differences when inverse translating, and probably a similar tendency will appear when contrasting her translation methods when inverse translating and comparing them to those she used when translating from English into Japanese. I believe that this analysis will help to procure a comprehensive scheme of Wakamatsu Shizuko as a woman translator of Meiji Japan. These are the references for this presentation.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Paula. Okay, we have to move on to our next speaker, Marcelina. I can't pronounce your name. Zoete Lesnikzak. Sorry. Assistant Professor at the Department of Oriental Studies, Nicolaus Copernicus University in Poland. She obtained her PhD at the Adam Mickiel University in Poznan with a dissertation titled The Presence of Drama and Theater in Tanizaki Junichiro's Literature. Inspired by the birth of her own children, she has since then shifted her focus to Japanese children's literature and its origin in the early 20th century. She has an ongoing translation project of Ogawa Mime's children's stories, which I understand will be the topic of her presentation today. Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for introducing. Yeah. Yes, I'm going to share. Yeah, yes, I'm going to share my screen now. Thank you, Professor Awestad, for introducing me. Also, thank you to EAJS for organizing this great and inspiring conference for us. Yeah, as for pronouncing my surname, my husband is Dutch, so it's Marcelina de Zoete. Leśniczak. Leśniczak is my Polish surname, my family name, and de Zoete is my husband's name. I got this as a first one. Okay, to start with, as it was already okay, I'm going to okay, can you see the presentation now?
Yes.
Okay, that's cool. So as it was already introduced by Professor Awestad, my today's speech title is Some Remarks on Literature of Ogawa Mimei, the father of modern Japanese children's literature. Ogawa Mimei is undoubtedly recognized as the most important, together with Hamada Hirosuke and Tsubota Joji, founder and writer of children's literature in Japan of the first 2 decades of 20th century. He was an extremely prolific writer, penning volumes of stories over 5 decades from the late Meiji period to the middle of the Showa period. He wrote over 1,000 children's stories, hundreds of short stories, many insightful essays, and several poems of great artistic values. And so, needless to say, he significantly contributed to the development of the genre in Japan, raising its value and inspiring many other writers. It is a general consensus among scholars of Japanese literature that Mimei's most important contribution to modern Japanese literature was within the genre of children's stories in the Taisho period. He indeed contributed to the modernization of children's literature by ushering in a new concept of the child who has a different interiority than adults have. This trend in children's literature in the Taisho period, which assumed a child pure and innocent, unlike adults, is called Doshin Shugi, the child's heart movement. His collection of children's stories entitled Akaifune, Red Ship, in 1910 was immediately embraced and later recognized as his pioneering work in the artistic child's heart movement. He's also known for his active involvement into Akai Tori, Redbird, a Japanese children's literary magazine founded and published by Suzuki Miekichi. This magazine was a pioneer of literary movements, as the above mentioned Doshin Shugi and Jido Bungaku. Juvenile literature. Redbird contributed to the popularization of modern artistic prose, which is commonly known. The modernization of children's literature and the new concept of a child were inseparable from the Taisho democracy movement, which was an enlightenment movement in politics and education. Even canonical writers such as Akutagawa Ryunosuke, Arishima Takeo, Tanizaki Junichiro, Kikuchi Kan, Sato Haruo, and Shimazaki Toson contributed their works to Redbird. Born in the Meiji era, he lived through Taisho and Showa, witnessing momentous and epochal changes in Japanese culture and society, which significantly influenced his works. Although later actively involved in the rise of the Japanese proletarian children's literature movement, he was still able to maintain Japanese tradition while infusing his children's stories with Western and modern elements. The chief topics of his literature can be categorized as following: Westernization, where stories demonstrate contact between Japan and the West; class conflict, where stories represent Ogawa's views on class through a socialist lens; nature and civilization, where stories represent Ogawa's critical opinions on the impact of civilization on nature; religion and morals, where Ogawa incorporates into his stories religion, including Christianity, and also the concept of the afterlife; and as last, Children and Childhood, where Ogawa treats their child protagonists and use them and their situations to instruct the reader. His children's stories were groundbreaking in many aspects due to his unique concept of the child, his poetic and abstract writing style, the dark and pessimistic yet romantic images and moods, and the strong socialistic and humanistic messages behind his works. Jingu Teruo, a researcher, one of many researchers of Japanese children's literature, and also Ogawa Mimei, suggests that Mimei created the form of dowa, a short creative fairy tale, in order for the author to assume an ideal child and express his ideal dream world. This was a major shift from the pre-modern approach to children's stories, and thus brought about the modernization of children's literature in Japan. Now I'm going to introduce some of his essays where Ogawa's view on children's literature, together with his deep belief in the mission of such literature, is clearly stated and presented. In April 1926, a big turning point occurred as Mimei left the Marxist proletarian literary circle and published an article in the Tokyo Nichi-Nichi Shimbun. Ogawa declared there that he would quit writing stories for adults and focus on writing children's stories from now on. In this article entitled Kongo Dowa Sakkani, from now on I will become a writer for children's stories, he writes, I have adored the freedom and purity of humanity and the imaginary world of justice. I do not know since when, but I came to be attracted by Dowa as an artist. I would like to devote the rest of my life to this, my unique poetic form. Mimei thus designate children's stories as his own unique poetic form, waga tokuina shikei, and explains that it is essential for him to express the freedom and purity of humanity and the imaginary world of justice. Mimei defined art as human activity that is meant to instill a primitive and holistic sensibility toward the world. Furthermore, he believed that children's stories were the most suitable medium for achieving this goal. In his autobiographical essay published in Bungai Shunryu in February 1951, Dowa o tsukutte 50 nen, Yukifuru kuni shijin no dokugo, there is a part where he explains the reason behind his 1926 transition. He writes, this is called literary art for art's sake. When I say this, I do not mean that I prioritize beauty or gorgeousness above everything. I mean that I believe the power of literary art has much more effect than politics or various movements. I want to take the stance that believes in literary art for art's sake. Mimei thought that the type of political literary art that was lauded by the Bundan at the time would not be able to realize the ideal world he dreamed of. He thus quit participating in any social movements and writing short stories, left the Bundan literary circle, and declared he would write Dowa only. Mimei left the Bundan and social movements not because he gave up on social improvement or art. On the contrary, he believed that only his Dowa were capable of bringing about an ideal world, even if his Bundan contemporaries disagreed. Considering Mimei's life in the Bundan up until 1926, this declaration was a monumental decision. Mimei debuted as a promising student of Tsubouchi Shoyo in 1903. In fact, Shoyo gave him the name Mimei and wrote a preface for Mimei's first collection of short stories in 1907, stating, Mimei is not someone who was made into a writer. Mimei was born to be a writer. So his decision to leave the Bundan behind and from now on focus on writing children's stories, children's literature, a niche genre at the time, shows how seriously he undertook this task. Mimei also believed that revolution should start from the consciousness of the people, and only then will society improve, not the other way around. Mimei thus thought that the kind of mentality that people should regain is that of children's. In his 1923 essay, Dowa ni Kanseru Shoken, he writes, adults are smarter than children. The meaning of this is that adults are corrupted as human beings. This is why we are trying to grasp the mentality of children, so we can once again summon the spirit from our dead adult minds. Mimei finds that the childlike mentality is able to bring back souls from corrupted adults. Thus, Mimei values the mentality of children over the corrupted and dead mentality of adults. Mimei believes, in other words, that children has a vital mentality that is unsustained by the human world, a type of innocence, purity or innocence that adults have lost. That's why Mimei thought that the key to the revelation of the consciousness of people, of adults, came through invigorating and purifying the minds of adults. This echoes with what Mimei wrote on the concept of the child in 1911 essay entitled Shonen Shujinko no Bungaku, which can be translated as literature where the protagonists are children. He conceives the child as someone who embraces a primitive and holistic sensibility of the primordial stage of individual psychology. He explains further, on the contrary to this adult's perception of the world, a child perceives everything as new. Every time he or she encounters an event, they immediately become afraid, wondering if the event threatens their life. Thus, they rely on their senses and assume that everything has some influence on their existence. Back in the primitive age, humans felt much more doubt, insecurity, and fear about the power of nature than now in our modern society. Just like this, children who are inexperienced in society embrace this primitive sensitivity for whatever they see. Thus, every sensible experience would appeal to their feeling of reality. Therefore, they have very high sensitivity, and everything is sensual for them to experience. Mimei argues that the child perceives everything as new with a sense of awe and fear. This is because a child is inexperienced in life and has a high sensibility to the wonders of nature. Because the child has not yet fully developed the analytic and inductive reasoning, he's unable to categorize and predict his surroundings, and as a result, he lives in the world with a sense of awe, fear, and uncertainty. Mimei conceptualized the child as such and aimed to express the freedom and purity of humanity and the imaginary world of justice through this notion of the child in his children's stories. Sorry. Mimei was pushed away from the central place in the children's literature in Japan from then on, and he spent his last days publishing book series of his complete works. There's a lot of them. When he died in 1961, the literary magazine is based on the critics. Bungaku, the magazine title is Bungaku, published an issue specialized for Mimei. And in 1992, a Children's Literature Award, one of the most important, the most prestigious children's literature awards in Japan, Ogawa Mimei Bungaku Show, was established to commemorate the 30 years after Mimei's death. At least until the end of Showa, Mimei's children's stories such as Akai Rosoku, the most representative, such as Akai Rosoku to Ningyo, Red Candles and the Mermaid, Nobara, Wild Rose from 1920, Tono-sama no Chawan from 1921, Tsukiyo to Megane from 1922, The Moon Knight and Eyeglasses, and also Nido to Touranai Tabibito, The Traveler Who Never Passes from 1926, appeared in elementary school Japanese textbooks. 5 years ago, in 2016, at Waseda University, there was a display and series of lectures dedicated to Mimei. Mimei's works was held just to commemorate the 25th anniversary of Ogawa Mimei Literary Award. Nowadays, Mimei's children's stories receive both favorable and negative criticism from Japanese children's literary critics. Although Mimei does not have successors for his kind of children's stories today, and he's more of a, let's say, historical figure in the modern Japanese literature. Mimei is not a forgotten writer, let's say. Even in the present day, he is remembered as the father of modern children's literature in Japan, and there must be a reason why he's commonly called Japanese Andersen. As I don't know how much time I have, but as a last slide, I would love to show you and tell you about translations of Ogawa Mimei's children's stories. So as you can see in the slide, it started very early, 1925, then 1957, 1997. And what is interesting, from 2018, it was held a project by Jeff D. Wisgo. He's American. He's also a blogger. He's holding a self-taught Japanese blog. He's non-academic researcher. He has no background in Japanese studies. So together with his wife, who is Japanese, they decided to translate now together in 5 volumes. The recent one, the 5th one, appeared in June or July, because I keep in touch with him. We are just, I'm just, because for me, it's very, very interesting, and I'm so curious about how what is his attitude to translating Ogawa. And it appeared that he doesn't know much about his life, his history, biography, and also without any research, he is just translating. And when I ask him if there sometimes appears the dialect of Niigata, Joets, where Ogawa was born, Jeff concluded that yes, but he's trying to make this Japanese to standardize, to make it a standard Japanese. So I already, and I forgot to say that this is available only as a Kindle version at Amazon, and he is planning in the future to make it a paper book. So for some who would be interested in Ogawa Mimei's children's stories, it's I can recommend it, because it's very interesting insight into this literature, and also a kind of a possible translation, because now we know that nowadays a translator is giving a lot of room for his own ideas, and is also called a second author of the literature. So I would like to finish my presentation on these informations, and Thank you for your attention.
Yes, thank you very much, Marcelina. The third speaker is me, and I'm professor at the University of Oslo. I wrote my dissertation on Natsume Soseki ages ago, maybe before even some of you were born. And I went on to write about other authors, but relatively recently, I went back to Soseki again by co-editing 2 volumes, essays on Soseki in Japanese and English. Okay, but I have to share my screen. Slideshow from beginning. Yes. Okay. During the past couple of years, I've been part of an interdisciplinary research team called Literature, Cognition, and Emotion, and have been inspired by recent developments in cognitive literary studies and cognitive science. I find their inclusive and extensive model of cognition very appealing. According to them, cognition is not only about thinking, but also about feeling, imagining, sensing, and all kinds of other activities that go on in our brain. And also, cognition is always situated and embedded in a wider sociocultural context. The implication is that something we tend to think of as private and introvert as feelings may have a much more active social role to play. There is a greater sociocultural dimension in them than we might think. My hypothesis is that the notion of feelings as thus socially embedded can be useful in reassessing a certain kind of Japanese narratives, self-reflective autobiographical genres such as zuihitsu and shinkyo shosetsu. What I would like to do today is to share some of the ideas I have about how the cognitive approach might help us reassess a certain kind of Japanese narratives, with Shiga Naoya as an example. I will come back to Abe Yoshishige which is in my abstract at the end of my talk. Shiga Naoya famously looked to his feelings for moral guidance in navigating the social landscape. His protagonist often talks about pleasant and unpleasant feelings that help him make important decisions. Instead of seeking them as subjective and unreliable resources to depend upon, I would argue they were in fact a part of a strategically wise precept to live by, given the specific social challenges Shiga and his contemporaries faced with as intellectuals of a young modern nation. Many of Shiga's works scrutinize the protagonist's sensibility, focusing on how it evolves in response to the social world that he interacts with. And in the process, he demonstrates the mind's ongoing experiences of and engagement with the world. But before examining Shiga's text, let me briefly refer to the recent discussion of emotion as socially constructed by Lisa Feldman Barrett, American neuroscientist. Barrett, in her 2017 book, How Emotions Are Made, argues that emotions are not as innate and spontaneous as we might think. They are culturally and socially constructed through our continuous interaction with the outside world. Thus, there are traces and imprints of the world as we have experienced them in our emotions. She emphasizes the importance of concepts that we construct from our experiences to make sense of what we encounter in our environment. My hunch here is that her notion of concepts is comparable to what we might call sensibility, as the sum of concepts accumulated over a lifetime. Barrett provides us with most up-to-date neuroscientific data to support her arguments, so she's groundbreaking in that sense. Needless to say, however, the idea of emotion and sensibility as socially constructed is not revolutionary. There is a long list of critical discourse on the subject, both recent and old, from David Hume, Natsume Soseki, Raymond Williams to Kamehiro. To make a long story short, the point of my argument is this. As many of these scholars have demonstrated, the notion of sensibility as embedded and constructed holds an important key to understanding the workings of subjectivities in their concrete historical situations. Sensibility is a culturally acquired habit of perception, grounded as much in your body as in your mind, and is closely tied to your life experiences. It is not something you can learn or unlearn very quickly or easily, but that doesn't mean it's not possible. It just means it often takes time and conscious effort to do so. So in that sense, there is always a tension between the cliched, standardized ways of saying things in yourself and your renewed future sensibility that is yet to replace the old one. And it is in this context that feelings or affects have a role to play. According to Lisa Feldman Barrett again, simple feelings of pleasure or displeasure, affects, come from an ongoing process inside you called interoception. Interoception is your brain's representation of the sum of what's happening right this moment within your body in the broad sense, which includes your interactions with the environment, as well as your processing of all the data. And the socially and culturally acquired patterns by which you process these data are closely tied to your concept or sensibility. Whether you are conscious or not, this process of interoception has budgetary consequences which manifest themselves as affect, she says. In short, affect is your brain's best guess about the state of your body budget and your social well-being. You can perhaps say that affect functions like your barometer, the body's way of telling you how comfortable or not comfortable you are in your life at the moment. Let me explain this in concrete terms by turning our attention to Shiga Naoya's short story, Chijo, translated as Infatuation by Lane Dunlop. This 8-page story starts with the protagonist's anguish over the decisions he has to make concerning his ongoing affair with a young geisha. His wife gave him an ultimatum the previous night, demanding an immediate settlement with the geisha. Sinking deep into negative affect, he reflects on the situation. He could not make up his mind what to do in this affair. The best would no doubt be to give up the woman, but he did not have the slightest desire to do so. He knew that the woman had no attachment to him, so when he got over it himself, they could quietly separate, well and good. But to repress his feelings to part with her now seemed unreasonable and unjust. He did not have the heart to go through with it. So here, the protagonist feels it is unreasonable to repress his own feelings just to go along with his wife's demand, when it is he who has been unfaithful. Most of us contemporary readers would probably feel that it is he who is being unreasonable. We might be tempted to ask how it resonates with the moral principle of honesty that Shiga was famous for. Is it not dishonest to betray one's wife? It takes a historical dip into the idiosyncratic and somewhat contradictory sensibility that he may have possessed to get some sense out of what he actually means by unreasonable. As we know, the modern ideology of love marriage and chastity became popularized among male Meiji intellectuals. This new idea often created tensions with their conservative upbringing. On the one hand, there was still little stigma associated with extramarital affairs for men. Occasional flings with professional women were more or less tolerated or even expected. On the other hand, there was an increasing tendency to look down upon sexual desire per se and a celebratory sense of romantic love in general. As it comes across in his reference to this woman later in the story, the protagonist would in fact condemn his affair if it was only about sex. But there was something more authentic in it, he says. Even though he knew that for her, he was just another customer, their relationship was different from a simple business transaction involving sex, which would have been less acceptable in his eyes. He therefore chooses to call this love and feels it unfair to repress it out of external pressure. Here you get a glimpse of the protagonist's intriguingly hybrid sensibility concerning sexuality. He disapproves sex without love, whereby he distinguishes himself from his predecessors from the Edo period. At the same time, he condones infidelity as long as it involves a component of love. But again, the infidelity he has in mind is in a very traditional setting of a geisha house-like institution, which specializes in what Foucault would call ars erotica. Going back to his novella, we should also note that the protagonist makes it clear he does not like deceiving his wife. In response to his wife's criticism that he condemns others' lies but not his own, he thinks to himself that it is she who is forcing him to lie with her lack of magnanimity. He says, "If you could stand the truth, I would always tell it to you." This is a typical pattern in his thinking, and he readily admits he's being selfish, proudly telling his wife he has always been that way. It is almost as if he means to argue that man's chauvinism, nurtured through his upbringing in the patriarchal elite culture of Taisho Japan, is a form of life that he cannot just drop out at will, a form of life in Wittgenstein's sense. It is something he cannot help and thus has to be accepted as given, the point of departure for all his moral strife. This does not mean, however, that he does not wish to change. He wants to change, but for that to be possible, he needs to work on his own feelings first, to cultivate relevant sensibility so that it will come naturally for him to do the right thing. The right moment to do the right thing comes at the very end of the story when he is in Tokyo on a business trip and receives a telegram from his wife begging him to come home. His wife's loneliness, which she could no longer bear, welled up in him. Although his business was not nearly finished, he decided to go back at once. Even though it is not made explicit, it is suggested here that he has now managed to sort out his feelings and is mentally ready to give up the other woman. Paradoxically enough, his wife's condition had to deteriorate first to such a degree that his sympathy and love pushes other feelings away. To sum up, you can say that his dilemma boils down to the question of how he can overcome his infatuation with honesty intact. And it is in this sense a moral battle. If there was selfishness in it, it is honesty nevertheless in his eyes. In other words, for him, a moral idea must first become part of his own sensibility to become truly his. I should also add that Shiga was not the only one who was obsessed with this idiosyncratic sense of honesty. Soseki, Abe Yoshishige, and many others in the Taisho Kyoyo Shugi group had the same obsessive hang up on honesty. As diverse as they might be in their ideology, belief, and personality, these Meiji Taisho intellectuals shared the challenge of adapting to a rapidly changing environment, constantly bombarded by new, unfamiliar currents of thought. No one can deny that it was a time of unprecedented transitions. When your head is full of new, supposedly progressive ideas that do not resonate with values nurtured in your upbringing, what do? Critical to superficially embracing everything modern and Western, Soseki famously lectured the importance of not dismissing your own sensibility as your moral guidance, jikohoni, and warned against hypocritical pretension. You are being dishonest unless your belief and actions are supported by your feelings rooted in your sensibility. It is in this connection that honesty took on a decisive meaning in the judgment of one's character for many of his generation. Borrowing Michael Border's concise definition, I would say, quote, sensibility is a site whereby knowledge is linked to affect and mind to body, where the sense perceptions presented to our conscious mind arrive already embedded within a network of social meanings. It is a site where mind and body meets on the level of pre-analytical unconscious perception. It is where you can be caught unawares, made to realize the aspects of your own self that you did not know of, which in turn allows you to make conscious adjustments. Taking negative affects seriously will therefore help you identify blind spots in your sensibility that have not caught up with your ideals. Shiga's project was to make sensibility itself an object of his own reflection through writing. Writing about unpleasant feelings was thus a key to creating the future sensibility that can meet the challenges of new times. One might even say that Shiga's novel, Anya Koro, is all about his struggle to discipline his sensibility into accepting women's infidelity this time, his wife's, as well as his own mother's, which he discovers he himself is the product of. Finally, before wrapping up, let me add a few words about Abe Yoshishige, my grandfather, who is after all in my abstract. The point of departure for this paper, when I wrote my abstract in 2019, was my personal interest in the Taisho Kyoyo Shugi group, which Abe Yoshishige was part of. He was also a member of Soseki's Thursday Club. After the war, he was a chancellor of Gakushuin Period School when I was in the Gakushuin Elementary School myself. I remember he used to come and gave lectures at school and always talked about the importance of honesty. I got sick and tired of his honesty talk as a child, and when I went to college, I became even more critical of his naive belief in honesty and humanism. I used to think he was an optimistic hypocrite who wasn't aware of his own double moral standards, because I knew for a fact that in his own household, things were pretty conservative and patriarchal. It is only relatively recently that I started taking an active interest in him, and this paper is my attempt at coming to terms with the Taisho Kyoyo Shigi mindset by historicizing it. Maybe it is a sign that I have mellowed over the years. I wrote a pretty harsh essay on Abe Yoshishige and the Taisho Kyoyo Shigi group a long time ago. Thank you for listening. Okay. Yes, let me go on to fourth speaker, Edwin Michelson. He received a BA and MA in Japanese Studies from Leiden University and his PhD in East Asian Studies from University of Toronto earlier this year. His dissertation titled Assembling Solidarity, Proletarian Arts and Internationalism in East Asia examines international solidarity, theorized and practiced in proletarian literary and cultural production surrounding May Day, Esperanto, birth control politics, and anti-war activism during the 1920s and 30s. Yes, because of the time limit, I would just give you the floor. Edwin?
Yes, thank you so much for your introduction. Also, a word of thanks to EAJS for putting this all together. And of course, to Nozomi and Filippo and the other IT people also to help us set up. And so without further ado, let me just share the screen. Okay, Hey, let me start. Tongues on Strike, Proletarian Voices in Esperanto Letter Writing in Imperial Japan. In his article, Esperanto and the Working Masses, written in Korean, published in the proletarian journal Chipdan Collective, in 1931, Esperantist Pak Ho notes how the ruling classes controlled modes of communication and what alternative modes were possible. He suggests that using Esperanto, the artificial language invented by Zamenhof just 4 decades ago, to undermine those restrictions. Living in the Japanese Empire, using a minority language, Korean, Pak was cognizant of Esperanto's benefits as auxiliary language for interlingual communication and explored ways how to implement Esperanto as a proletarian language. Pak acknowledged that, quote, the geographical conditions make it impossible to visit foreign comrades and attend important international conferences. To overcome the spatial distances, Pak insisted that communication is only possible, quote, with the language of correspondences, newspapers, and magazines, end quote, suggesting how writing in Esperanto through various media could be used for international solidarity. Pak's geographical conditions not only imply geographical distance, but also the restraints of mobility, financial and linguistic barriers facing proletarians when trying to interact with foreign counterparts. He argued that the costs of learning foreign languages are too high for proletarians and are also controlled by the bourgeoisie through educational institutions. Moreover, he condemned the national bourgeoisie for using foreign bourgeoisie literature for translation exams as a way to boycott foreign leftist literature. Pak recommended proletarians to use Esperanto as the ultimate class weapon. And especially, he argued that the act of translating proletarian writings into Esperanto was an act of resistance against these classes, the ruling classes. Pak identifies how language becomes codified to serve ruling classes and nation-state building. To counter such codification, he considered Esperanto to be a language in which speech does not oppose writing, nor does the sonorous voice oppose the written voice. Rather, it had interchangeable components of linguistic resistance designed to thwart language restrictions. So proletarian Esperantists translated local struggles through literature, letters, textbooks, and dictionaries across various parts of the world in a universal lexicon of Esperanto. But how could such putatively universal meanings be rendered in an artificial language? Was Esperanto capable of representing something that conventional languages could not? Could it successfully transmit the diverse proletarian experiences into a single semantics? And for that to happen, how was a voice for Esperanto users created? Preceding Pak's article, Akita Ujaku and the teacher, Esperanto teacher and proletarian playwright, had identified Esperanto's potential in contributing to class struggles in several articles. Akita responded to government policies well underway since Meiji, aimed at homogenizing various patois into a standardized written and spoken national language. Born in Kuishitohoku, a region known for its linguistic distance from the Kanto region, whose diction was the basis for the standard language, Akita railed against what he considered to be the bourgeois language policies used as another form of capitalist enslavement. In 1922, Akita had already examined the oppressive nature of national languages and their intricate relationship with the bourgeois ideology. He did this in his article, Esperanto as a Rebellious Tongue, which was part of a 1922 special issue on Esperanto published in the general interest journal Kaizo. Akita argued in tandem with the cultural enslavement of humans that the spoken language, or the tongue as he calls it, also becomes, quote, a slave of words. He further critiqued the phonocentric homogenization of languages, which valued speech over writing for being a pure form of transcendental truth. According to Akita, complicit in this verbal enslavement were national languages designed to block any expression of the human will. Akita suggests that the Esperanto movement was a strike movement of the tongue, Stano Streiki Undo, focused on disentangling the tongue from linguistic domination. In doing so, Akita envisioned Esperanto acting as a linguistic strike, which would lead to a, quote, liberation of bourgeois science and a shared language of the proletariat. After several years of promoting Esperanto in the 1920s, many proletarian Esperanto movements, such as the Japanese Proletarian Esperanto Union in Tokyo, the left-wing branch of Esperanto Yulian in Shanghai, and the Proletarian Esperanto Subcommittee in Taipei, were formed in East Asia in the early 1930s as branches within the larger umbrella of proletarian movements. Proletarian Esperanto movements were first and foremost an educational movement and invested in promoting Esperanto among proletarians. They published many textbooks and learning materials, as well as organizing Esperanto exhibitions and classes all geared to radicalize proletarian tongues. Most notably was the 6-volume Proletarian Esperanto course, totaling 1,294 pages under the editorial supervision of Akita Ujaku and edited by figures such as Nakagaki Kojiro, Muto Maruksu, and Takagaki Hiroshi, who were all translators, writers, or linguists among the proletarian movement. This course was immediate a success and sold over 10,000 volumes and had widespread reach across East Asia. The editors of this course envisioned social change through linguistic empowerment. They argued that what such change is visible in individuals, not the power of individuals, but rather the network of people active in society that bring about change. They call this the power, quote, the emergence organized as individual power. Key to initial social change was the voice, which plays a central role throughout the course. This shows that Akita's striking tongue was not a mere figure of speech, but envisioned a metamorphosis of voice into a weapon for proletarian Esperanto learners. The editors explain that human beings converse through a universal material, namely the human voice. When sounds are dispatched from the enunciation organ, and they are obstructed, and the editors provide an example, for example, of noise in the factory, various supplemental materials such as ink, hands, neck, or flags can be used to transmit thought. The editors suggest that when sonic voices are not possible to convey speech, supplemental materials allow the voice to traverse, quote, geographically distant places, temporarily to later generations, and simultaneously to great numbers of people. And so echoing Puck's notion as well. This conceptualization of voice as polyvocal and transverse is crucial for my understanding of Esperanto. It epitomizes how proletarian Esperanto movements considered language through voice in all its manifestations was capable to connect proletarians across the globe and to resist linguistic systems of power. With the rise of proletarian movements and a brand of internationalism which envisioned the community of the world proletariat, these movements set up correspondence branches to improve and increase exchange among them using mail, telegram, and telegraph, all kind of fairly new technologies, at least. Well. And these correspondence branches added Esperanto as a lingua franca to expedite and improve social interaction among proletarians. Esperanto learners could either search for a foreign individual pen pal in an address column printed in journals, send their letters either directly or in translation to journals for publication in a special correspondence section, or participate in group correspondence organized by proletarian Esperanto associations. The addresses in journals also often included the occupation and interests of correspondents to further help readers find like-minded individuals. Readers also requested their own addresses and preferences to be printed by the editors in this section. Looking at the various correspondence columns in many proletarian Esperanto journals that are still available, we catch glimpses of the numerous networks that existed connecting thousands of Esperantists worldwide. Proletarian Esperantists in East Asia invested eagerly in letter writing with counterparts in the Soviet Union, Europe, North America, and Oceania, and they also included often photographs and other items. Proletarian Esperanto movements understood the value of establishing and solidifying international proletarian networks, as they were useful for introducing the idea of foreign struggles, class struggles, and the socialist life. They devoted much of their time and space in journals towards developing and applying writing skills and in learning how to be a correspondent. In the first issue of Proletarian Esperanto journal, Comrade, the editors published an article about the structure and the operation of Proletarian Esperanto correspondence branches called PEC, or Proletarian Esperanto Correspondence, Correspondence, which were also established across East Asia. According to the editors, the correspondence office had three major objectives to fulfill, which was to have international mutual contact and to provoke unique correspondence activities, share perspectives of workers and farmers from all over the world, and to support with translation from and correspondence in Esperanto. Esperanto letter writing held the possibility of generating infinite strings of connections between individuals and groups, eliminating spatial boundaries. Correspondents of all backgrounds were capable of participating actively in an emancipating form of knowledge production. The article concludes with a thorough explanation of the three layers of non-centrist and non-hierarchical organization comprising PEC. These three layers together formed multi-directional and interconnected networks among proletarian Esperantists worldwide, as well as the interlocutors of other proletarian organizations. And the journal, which was published in the Soviet Union, called Internationalist, acted as an exchange platform, which coagulated the various strands of local struggles and activities facilitated by the national Esperanto movements. These letters resembled then technologies like radio or telegram, in that voices were mechanicalized or disembodied and traversed spaces to other eyes and ears. In doing so, a new relationship with other voices was created, not sonic but silent, yet interacting and enabling virtual encounters. Proletarian Esperanto journals and textbooks became invested in providing education on how to write correspondence, and as such published articles on letter writing in Esperanto. For example, this article by MT, used his initials likely to remain anonymous for the censors, explains in a Camarado article how to start an international correspondence, the various steps on how to write a beginner level correspondence for those who lack the skills to do so. According to MT, the process consists of 5 main steps, each which are then divided in several sub-steps. By explaining each step, MT offers a uniform template for correspondence between the readers of comrade and foreign correspondence. He suggests writing formats such as the opening and closing of a letter, as well as tips on the logistics such as what paper and how much postage to use. The uniformity, though, with which MT instructs the readers confirms partially the lack of organic development of Esperantists that was often critiqued by others, Marxists like Antonio Gramsci, for example, and is derivative of previous writing systems, such as the particularly one, the European system. But without it, he argued, many people cannot write letters. In his instruction, however, MT neglects also to discuss the circumvent censorship of letters by the authorities. Such strategies would have been crucial when assuring letters arrived and without redaction, because according to concurrent police reports, censorship seriously curtailed the circulation of Esperanto letters. While the majority of correspondents were located in the Soviet Union and Weimar as Germany, inter-East Asian letter writing among proletarian Esperantists also increased throughout the late 20s and the 1930s. Letters circulated throughout East Asia, which connected rural villages in Tohoku and Taiwan, as well as metropoles as Tokyo, Seoul, Shanghai, Taipei. All writers engaged directly or indirectly in conversation through the pen, and East Asia shared stories of local manners and customs, but also topics such as imperial oppression and violence were discussed. Although it's difficult to locate extant letters, they are most likely lost or hidden in private collections. Proletarian Esperanto journals frequently published letters, either in translation or in Esperanto. For example, Kim Sang, an Esperantist from Korea, had his letter published in Japanese in the section Esperanto at the Factories and Countryside. The editors described the section as a, quote, place of exchange of debate and experience between readers. Kim sent his letter, and whether it's written in Japanese, Korean, or Esperanto, it remains unclear. It's difficult to verify. To share the language struggles he had experienced in childhood. As a child, Kim and his classmates were fined by the teacher for speaking Korean, but Kim had difficulty understanding why adults were imposing such language restrictions on school children. After moving to Japan to work as a day laborer, he attended night classes at a middle school and English school, only to learn that the bourgeois insincere words, as he called it, were similar to the language restrictions at his elementary school in Korea. As an adult, Kim began to understand power imbalances better, and as such linked suppression of the Korean language with oppression by the bourgeois class. Soon afterward, he heard about Esperanto from friends who were imprisoned. Kim immediately felt that, quote, Esperanto was our language and not just the words bourgeoisie could arrange for their own use. And as long as we have this language, we can talk freely with our comrades from all over the world. Rather than indulging directly in physical violence or military action, Kim perceived Esperanto to be, quote, a weapon of international solidarity that could subvert, circumvent, and replace the imperial language. Kim's letter exemplified colonial linguistic struggles and revealed how colonial Esperantists could have their voices heard across East Asia and beyond. At the same time, Kim's letter printed in Japanese revealed also a limit maybe of Esperanto by reinforcing Japanophone intimacies and repressing colonial languages by major languages. As a result, the equalizing potential of Esperanto is also a bit eroded. So if I also running out of time, and I only have this letter, but also other letters here, just you see on the right, a letter from Soviet comrades to the Chinese Esperanto movement, and on the left, the letters from the German and from Germany to the Japanese one. But I will just now move on to my conclusion. So then to conclude briefly, Faced with numerous visible and invisible linguistic, geographical, and social borders across and beyond East Asia, Esperanto proved to be an effective medium for proletarian cultural movements to bridge and mitigate divisions among proletarians. In contrast to imperial and national languages and their native foreign hierarchies, the stateless Esperanto was considered ideal by proletarian intellectuals to create linguistic equality and facilitate intra-East Asian and worldwide exchange. While intellectuals initially accused Esperanto of Eurocentrism due to its lexicon and script being derived from European languages, proletarian Esperantists countered these allegations because they considered its grammar from mostly to Altaic and Turkic languages, so Asian languages. And it also demonstrated the flexibility to create non-European words. You could just add new words to the vocabulary. Among the various media available, then international correspondence through letters between Esperantists was successful in facilitating intimate exchanges between individuals as well as collective interaction among proletarian groups to create a shared yet silent voice for proletarians to overcome the geographical restrictions with a virtual proximity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Edwin. Can you, yeah, okay. We have 19 minutes for questions. I would just, Paula. I see Paula, Filippo. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just applauding.
Oh, you were just applauding. Okay, okay. So yes, it's confusing, these hands. Anyone raising hands? Well, maybe I should. No questions. Yeah.
If I may, I'll ask a question.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, please.
I have several questions across the.
I think we have a hand. Okay.
Okay. Sorry, Filippo. Do you want to go ahead?
No, I meant we have one question.
Okay. Sorry. Atsuko Sasaki-sensei.
Atsuko Sensei. Yeah.
No, you are first. I just wanted to put myself in the queue. That's all. Please.
Okay.
Okay. I'm convener, so floor is yours. So.
No, Nozomi-san, dozo onegaishimasu.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I should. You have limited time, so I should go for it. So I have several questions, but I think because we have other questions, I'll focus on one question. I have a question to Marcellina. Thank you very much for the presentation. Really fascinating. I think one of the.
No, thank you very much. It's just as I forgot to mention, it's the ongoing research, so it's still yet a lot of things for me to discover. So.
I think one of the things I noticed was it's really fascinating that idea of Doshin Shugi and how the kind of idea of children's innocence is really focused. It really reminds me of Rousseau's Emile's idea, how when he talks about the child, he's really focused on this idea of innocence in the child. Mm-hmm. And when we think about the kind of when Rousseau's Emile is translated, it's kind of really similar time that when your author is started writing on it, and he specifically writes on boy's story. So I think something going on from my point of view. Probably this is rather than question, rather it's more about comment, and that's something quite interesting to me, how, also you mentioned about Taisho democracy, this idea of individuality is really focused and focusing on the child's education in one way in children's literature. So it might be interesting to think about the idea of innocence in childhood.
Yeah, thank you for your comment. It's a very, very important to me. I agree. I completely agree with you. And what is most important, and I also wanted to mention today, but because due to the limited time, is that the children's heart, the innocence and purity was discovered in Taisho, but way earlier. I mean, after 1868 Meiji, when we enter Meiji period. First of all, a child was discovered. Of course, many researchers argue, like a researcher Ino Kuma, or together with Karatani Kojin, and this is very important and interesting, just to trace that how it first the kid emerged the discovery of a child, and then how it was transformed into discovering the child's innocence and purity. And what is more interesting, it's visible in the literature as a long process. And depending on the authors, the style, for example, naturalism and also neo-romanticism, the authors of that time, they try to show it to present it in a different way. So it's also a very challenging for a researcher on children's literature, on Japanese children's literature, how it's progressing, for example, because like I stated today, the Dowa Ogawa Mimei, he sort of started Dowa, and it is beginning of 1912, and then it develops into something else. So it's amazing for me, from my point of view, how the literature, but it's always with Japanese literature, you know, it's never evolutionary. One goes smoothly to the other, and that's what is interesting and very involving in this research.
Okay, thank you. Atsuko Sensei? You have to unmute.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So I have a question for Professor Reiko Osit, and I really enjoyed your talk, and I learned a lot. I think that there is a very great potential for thinking about emotions in terms of cognitive science and neuroscience, and so I was very fascinated with what you brought to the table. And I guess that my question would be, if there is any consideration of interpersonal relations or communality in terms of emotion. That is to say that I think that emotion is not only coming from inside the connection of the body and mind, or the knowledge and affect that one person experience, but also in terms of the relation. And especially in the last quotation that you have shown us from Shiga Naoya's short story, it is about his understanding of his wife's perspective, what kind of emotion she had, and what kind of situation, the bodily situation. She was alone and she was feeling this emotion. And so I thought that it was a very interesting quotation that you showed us, because it really is a showcase of this sensibility that you were talking about, how it is very much connected between brain and body and so on. But in terms of this interpersonal relations, is there any way that the neuroscientists or cognitive science specialists can contribute? Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I mean, I'm very happy to hear that you liked it. Well, it's really sort of an ongoing, work in progress, and it's a very complicated story. So I try to simplify the picture a bit to make it understandable, easy to understand in 15 minutes. But this interpersonal relationships plays an important role, and that's a sort of the sum of your life experience. And I was actually thinking of, like Soseki's division of how your sensibility is being influenced right this moment in your life, at the level of your life, or at the collective level, your generation, like people, friends, and the society level. So there are many different levels, I guess. And if something happens just once, it might not have an impact on you. But interpersonal relationship, there are certain kinds of patterns, and it's an accumulative effect of your life experience, which some of it does have an impact on your sensibility, some of it doesn't. So it's a pretty complicated business, I think. And I'm not sure if I can really answer your question, other than to say that there are layers of emotions, how they influence your sensibility. So, but thank you for asking that question. I mean, it's I don't really have a quick answer to this.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Anyone else? I might actually ask some questions. I was wondering about the Wakamatsu Shizuko's Shokojo is the Japanese title, right? And
Shokoshi?
Shokoshi, yeah, Shokoshi, yeah. I love Shokoshi, yes. And I was wondering, I grew up with it, and I just sort of, love Shokoshi, growing up thinking that it's internationally famous. But then I realized that maybe it's just in Japan, or is it because of Wakamatsu Shigeko's wonderful translation, or do you think it's a coincidence, or it's especially popular in Japan?
Yes, I cannot speak for other countries, but as far as I know, in at least France, Spain, England, Frances Burnett was especially famous in Europe, in England at her time. But after that, she kind of disappears a little bit from the literary context. She was very big in Japan, thanks to Wakamatsu Shizuko's translation. And in fact, even nowadays, this text is being retranslated into modern Japanese, and they still use the title Shokoshi, which is not the title, right? It should be Fonleroy Koshaku or something like that.
Yeah.
The title is still, they are still using her title, which I think speaks tons to the influence that Shizuko's translation had and still has in modern Japan.
Right. Yeah.
And also this links to, go ahead.
And another question I wanted to ask you was the reason why she chose to translate this
Otsugomori?
Otsugomori, yeah.
That's
it's a very difficult title.
Story.
Saikaku story. I was wondering, I have read in Wikipedia that her father was a samurai.
Yes.
And he went through a pretty traumatic period transition because of this, the changes in the Meiji period. And I was wondering if it was her attempt at sort of trying to understand the mindset of her father or something, because it's a very samurai-oriented piece, right?
Yeah, there might be something there because her father's family, he was a retainer of the Aizu Wakamatsu lord, which fell in the Meiji Restoration, and she had a very traumatic family. She went from foster homes and to this adopted family. And we can see that link, maybe this kind of looking for her father figure into the translation of this samurai. And also regarding her maybe traumatic experience as a child, she felt strongly regarding the rights of children. Like this relates maybe to Marcelina's presentation, but Shizuko already at the last decade of the 19th century, she starts to defend the rights of children, saying that they are their own people. Because like Marcelina said, in Meiji Japan, they weren't even independent people, right? They were considered possessions. So there's a lot of these things going on. The image of the samurai, also it's the Japonism time. So, Europe wants to see the figure of the samurai maybe. So maybe it was twofold, her own akogare or interest for the samurai, and also trying to maybe sell this image of the samurai as being humble and willing to sacrifice themselves for their honor. So that might be it. Thank you for your questions.
And I have a question, Edwin, if no one else is asking. I was wondering how Esperanto is faring now in contemporary world. Has this project abandoned, or people must certainly have changed their view on language, or how easy or not easy it is to teach everyone Esperanto?
Yes, that's a very good question. Thank you so much. And you would be surprised, though, still how active the community is.
Okay.
It's difficult to give kind of concrete numbers. Some say 1 million, others say 10 million speakers. But there's yearly conferences across the globe. And actually in China, in many schools, they still have Esperanto on the curriculum. So you can choose to study Esperanto. And they have just opened a museum over there a couple of years ago. And so there's a lot of exchange. I attended an Esperanto class in a very small cellar in Korea where you have 10 Koreans from all different ages, from 20 to 80, sitting together to learn and still exchanging a lot. So there's a lot of activity going. Of course, the ideals have dumbed down a bit. They know that maybe Esperanto is not going to replace everything and will be the world language, but they still see it. It's kind of that kind of idealism that still comes with it, that there's somehow a stateless kind of, that doesn't come with English as an Anglophone kind of imperial language. So there's still a lot of stuff going on. There's being translations being done, journals published. So it's still very much alive. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Atsuko-sensei, Sakaki-sensei.
Thank you very much. I also have a question for Edwin. And so I understand that Esperanto has contributed to overcome the lack of communication across the national languages. It becomes a universal language for proletarians, especially. But what about the regional speech? The Esperanto users speak in their everyday life their regional speech, like Hogan, dialect, or if they are to, I guess that I don't know if they were to meet with people from other regions, but that also have helped to have the common language such as Esperanto, which is one. And another thing, just quickly, is that the literacy rate of the proletarians at the time that you are talking about, and how they, their proficiency in writing letters, for example, in general, not just in Esperanto, but in general, and if how Esperanto was really a very miraculous solution to everything. If you could just elaborate on that, that would be great. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for these wonderful two questions. So the first one on dialect, that's a very good question, because as I mentioned already, it's a stateless language. So the dialect, the accent that comes with the language was not so much of a concern. And it's very interesting to already see Futabate Shime, who introduced Esperanto to Japan by translating and preparing the first textbook, saying, well, English talk with an English accent, French with a French accent, but there's no hierarchy of a standardized native language. So there's no problem that people speak in dialects. And so Akita Ujaku, when he visits Russia, the Soviet Union, he also kind of is always, everyone has their own accents, obviously. So the Japanese have the Japanese accent, and some letters are more difficult than others to pronounce, but there's no immediate kind of judgment of like, this is the native form of Esperanto, because there was no nativity, still to say, to Esperantos, if you will. But I must say also then at the same time, there was very little chance for Esperantists to talk. So you get these study groups across East Asia, but they talk in their native language among each other, because there's no chance then to meet, as Pak said. So then the letters, that's why writing becomes so dominant. And to get to your question on literacy, which is another very good question, because Esperanto came at a time when there was a lot of language reform at the time, when in China, like, what are we going to do with the kanji? They're too difficult, they're too many, we have no standardization. So maybe global English, simplified basic English, that we're all competing with each other, what will be the simple language. So while in Japan, many had already maybe some formal education, either in a year or two, maybe at most, but in China and Korea, there was most had no education at all. We're all illiterate as well. So yeah, the Esperanto also became very much a literacy movement to say, well, maybe this will be a shortcut to increase that proletarians can read and write. And so, but obviously that's why they invented the group letter writing, so that together, so that letters could sometimes be written down a bit faster as individuals struggled with like, can I write a letter by me? I don't know what to do and whatnot. So yes, that's very good. Thank you.
Okay, just maybe one question. Can I just take the liberty of asking Marcelina about children's literature again? I was wondering if the view of children's literature has evolved very much since the Taisho period. It must have. Because the children, as we see, are not as innocent as maybe we used to think. Any comments on that? Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor, for your question. First of all, as it was the beginning of shaping the literature, so we can say that this kind of presentation of a child was omnipresent. And knowing that there were many political, historical events, especially the 30s propaganda. For example, Shonen Krabu, a magazine devoted only to boys, and also there was literature published on that magazine. It turned a little bit into propaganda, and also raising a strong boy who will be a warrior, who will not be scared of going for war, for example. After the war, I mean, post-war literature, it also changed a little bit. It is observed a big influence of American literature, especially illustrated books, also short stories for children, and also the influence of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, especially Genbaku Bungaku. So also how the kids coped. Also, kids come to being narrators. They are narrating.
Okay, can you just wait a minute, because it's 2 o'clock now, and they say
okay, sorry.
Continue the discussion here. If we click this after this session is over, I don't know how strict they are about the timing.
I think it should be a little bit more flexible.
Okay, sorry. I just worried because I got the
yeah, you can you can finish the answer.
Okay, sure. Sorry.
Okay.
Yep.
Is it okay?
And yeah, sure. Just go ahead.
No. I mean, I just don't want to take much of your time, but it's like a very it's another chapter for a long story, even for like books with 3 volumes, I would say. But it's interesting. Evolving, it's changing, and depending on times and what I mentioned, the war, for example, and post-war, especially. Well, what this I am now, as my next coming project will be the first-hand records of children who experienced Hiroshima, and I just received 5 books from my student who spent a wonderful year in Japan. He just came back to Poland, and he brought some books for me. So I'm going to go through it, and I'm also going to compare it with the literature of children in Poland, of Jewish children in Poland who experienced Shoah. Because I see, I mean, war trauma is also very essential, important nowadays, especially. So,
yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, is this from before this raising hand, or maybe
I think Atsuko Sensei. Okay, I think it's done. I think it's from previous.
Oh, okay, from the time before. Okay, well, and then thank you very much for coming to the session, and hopefully I'll see you around somewhere.
Yes.
And ありがとうございました。ご苦労様です。
Thank you very much, for wonderful to share.
Yeah, it's nice to see you. Even
see you in 2 years live. Let's hope.
Okay, bye.
Bye. Have a great day. Bye. Thank you. Arigato.
Thank you.
Thank you.